Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at SAIS Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. And welcome to our webinar on Asia after Afghanistan. Of course, we also stand in the shadow of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and just after the conclusion of a historic and America's longest war. Of course, there are many issues, historic issues involved, but first of all, we would like to take a look at the Afghanistan itself, its positioning in the broader geopolitical context, and also at some of the more timeless, long-standing issues with which Asia is confronted today as it moves toward the future. Afghanistan, of course, is in the heart of Asia. It has a short, mountainous 70-kilometer border with China, but it also borders on several Central Asian countries, on Iran, on Pakistan, and is in close proximity to India. And so it lies at the heart of a Central Asia in transformation. In terms of the long-term trends that we need to be conscious of as we think toward the future. Of course, the rise of China itself since the modernizations of the late 1970s, and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, and the transformation of the heart of Eurasia that occurred following that. The possibilities deepening, of course, over the years for relationships between China and Europe, which pass very close across Central Asia in some proximity to Afghanistan. And then, of course, the tremendous broader rise of Asia, including, of course, Southeast Asia, and broad relationships across the continent of Europe and Southeast Asia, fatefully also, of course, of the Persian Gulf to Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia as a result of the rising energy demand that has come about because of East Asian growth. So there are a range of issues involved. For the United States, of course, the strategic question, both over the past 20 years, something that confronted the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and Trump administration as well, and now Biden, the Middle East or Asia. The Clinton administration worked hard to shift toward East Asia, of course, with conflicts continuing in the Middle East and also in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades. That was difficult, but certainly the issue confronts the world, not only the United States, but Japan and other key nations going forward. Today, for our panel, we have 4 distinguished specialists. Professor Kuni Miyake as the special advisor to the cabinet of Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. Ashley Townshend, who's the director of the Foreign Policy and Defense at the United States Studies Center at University of Sydney. Dr. Joseph Chinyong Liow, who's Dean of the College of Humanities and Chair of International Politics at Nanyang Technological University. And then finally, Ambassador Shear, also with us here, a senior fellow of the Reischauer Center, but a distinguished career in both the State Department and the Defense Department following that. To start, as I mentioned, a key issue today in the wake of Afghanistan, or how will the relationship and the centrality of the Middle East in American foreign policy and in global affairs transition to a new approach to East Asia, and what are some of the constraints on that? Professor Miyake, as I say, has a distinguished career and also has served as in the foreign ministry in a number of distinguished positions, including at the Middle East Bureau. Kuni, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Kent. First of all, you talk about Asia after Afghanistan. So what the Taliban takeover meant for us. As an Arabic language officer who worked on the Japan-US Security Treaty Affairs and also stationed in China. So I'm not saying this in my capacity as a special advisor, just the one private researcher. I was shocked, but not surprised, you know, when I saw the fall of Kabul to Taliban, because we knew that it was coming since last year. The fall of Kabul symbolizes the shift of US strategic priority from the war on terror in the Middle East to Indo-Pacific, focusing on China. And similar sort of a shift happened in 1991. But I would call this withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan as something strategically a right decision. But tactically, of course, it was not as successful as it wanted to be. The United States fought for 2-3 decades on the ground in the Middle East, while China rose as a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific region. So for good reasons, the shift of US priority is welcomed by the US allies and friends in our region. And it's a blessing for us. But also, we have to make sure that we must expedite the process of strengthening our deterrence in the free and open Indo-Pacific region. And I hope it's not too late. The United States fought there for too long, I'm afraid. So it's not too late, but we have a lot to do in the next decade or so. So, but I'm sure the details will be discussed later by other panelists. I don't want to go into details. I just want to give you a few more perspectives. One, as I said, you said Asia after Afghanistan. Is it really after Afghanistan? Have we finished Afghanistan? Probably not. For 2 reasons I'm worried about. First reason is that, see, the power vacuum created by the withdrawal of the US forces is so big. And I'm sure that everybody is interested in filling the vacuum. Every major regional powers, including China, is working on it. So the new regional chain reaction has already started on or even before August 15. And this, you cannot control it. The United States or us, nobody can control this chain reaction. And we will not know what will happen next. I'm not saying this, it's not necessarily I'm expecting a major terror attack in the foreseeable future, maybe soon, but because terror cancers, in a sense, have already metastasized all over the Middle East. So I do not, but at the same time, I do not underestimate the Middle East hand in Washington, D.C. So my worry, and probably the worries of the friends and allies in East Asia and Pacific, is that what if something happens in the Middle East? Then the United States' attention would be diverted back to the Middle East. That's what I'm slightly worried about. But it's not. We are not in the year 2001 anymore. So I'm sure that we can be a little bit more optimistic than 2001. The second issue I wanted to touch upon is about my country. That's why I told you that I'm not saying this in my capacity as special advisor to the Prime Minister. Second reason I'm a little bit worried about is that I'm particularly interested in the change of government in my country. The LDP presidential election is coming up. And by the end of this month, we will have a new president of the LDP. And sooner or later, we will have a general election. So what we are having more and more candidates, and every day is so fluid that it's so difficult to predict the future. But one thing may be for sure, we need a strong government. And secondly, maybe Abe Suga era may be over. I don't know. It could be, because we were making the right decision at the right time in the right direction for the past 9 years. But I hope that there will be no change in this direction. I'm sure that as long as LDP wins, there won't be a drastic change. Quad will be convened. G7 will put emphasis on, and the policy would not change, hopefully. But what may change could be a possible rebound in terms of either modality or speed and the policy implementation. We know what to do. We all share the interest, and we know what to do. But I hope that we can continue doing so in the same speed and modality as Mr. Abe and Suga had created. Well, I stop here, and the microphone will be back to Kent. Thank you.
Well, if I might, thank you very much, Kuni. That's quite fascinating. There's one piece in this equation that I didn't hear, and of course, it's your major neighbor, China. Do you have any thoughts or any expectations as to how China or Russia may react to these uncertainties in Afghanistan?
Yeah, as I said, there's a power vacuum already, and they are behind Pakistan, and Pakistan is behind Taliban. So I think they have been working on it indirectly. But now the US forces are gone, and China will have to be involved directly. And for two reasons. One, maybe in order to facilitate enhance their interest in that part of the world, including economic interest, strategic interest, but at the same time, probably if I were the leader of China, I would encourage Taliban, if they could, not to allow any jihadists or mujahideens of Uyghur to do something against somewhere in the Xinjiang Uyghur area in the foreseeable future. That could be their nightmare. And I don't think that China could tolerate that. So I'm sure many people say that this is a Chinese offensive period. Not necessarily. I think they think this very defensively, in my view.
You don't think that Afghanistan could be a Chinese Vietnam the way, say, Afghanistan was for the Russians and for the British and for the Americans?
Kent, this is my dream, But it's that the Brits did, the Soviets did, the Americans did, and if China got involved in Afghanistan and helping Taliban, I'm sure that there's so many enemies of Taliban. So they will hate China. But China is probably smarter than this. If I were Chinese leader, I would try to influence the events in Afghanistan through Pakistan.
I see. So they're going to be able to avoid what all the other major great powers have recently.
Well, if they can, they could be their graveyard too.
Could be, yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Miyake. We have as our next participant a distinguished commentator from Australia, Ashley Townshend, as I mentioned, is currently with the University of Sydney, but has published very widely, including on this whole subject of Eurasia's transformation and the implications for Indo-Pacific. You've done, I noticed some very interesting work that you've done recently on that. Ash, could you give us your thoughts?
Thanks, Dean Calder, and thanks very much for hosting us today. Look, my thoughts on Afghanistan, I think, pick up very nicely from where Kuni left off. And I think much like our colleagues in Japan, the first point I want to make is that Australia, in many ways, has applauded this decision by the Biden administration to withdraw US forces from Afghanistan after 2 decades of an intervention which frankly achieved very little at the end of the day. And the reason that Australia applauds it is also the same articulated by Kuni, that we do see that Afghanistan, more than anything, has become a distraction for the United States. The Middle East, more broadly, has been a distraction for the United States for that duration of time, and a distraction on getting Washington to really prioritize and focus its energies, its resources, its attention, its diplomacy on rebalancing to Asia, on addressing and responding to and shaping the rise of China. And I guess, as Kuni suggested, over that 30-year period since the end of the Cold War, and certainly in the last 20 years since 9/11, Asian countries have grown increasingly concerned that the United States is not able to prioritize the important and is consistently distracted by the urgent, or that which becomes path dependent. Getting US focus on Asia has also been a key pillar of Australia's alliance management and foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States. If you go back to the first Australia-United States ministerial dialogue of the Trump administration, the two countries set out a work agenda to focus the alliance on the Indo-Pacific, and that ranged from priorities to do with regional governance, to regional security, to the character of diplomacy, to countering Chinese grey zone coercion. It was an important roadmap, and yet a couple of years later, in 2019, the Trump administration, in its build-up maximum pressure campaign against Iran, requested Australia send additional forces to the Persian Gulf, which Australia reluctantly acquiesced to, sending a maritime surveillance aircraft and an additional frigate to the Middle East on a very short duration patrol. Now, you need to bear in mind, Australia has been a supporter of the United States at an operational level in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria since 9/11. Australia has not been the biggest contributor by NATO standards, but it's certainly been a substantive one and a consistent contributor.
Yes.
Australia has now withdrawn its own forces, not just from Afghanistan, but from the Middle East more broadly. And in fact, last year, we ended a 30-year rotational deployment to the Persian Gulf, which I think is a signal of just how important it is for Australia that we extract ourselves and the alliance from the Middle East to focus on the Indo-Pacific. I think the second point that I'd like to make here is that Australia, unlike European allies of the United States, does not see any concerns about US commitment to security partners in Asia arising as a result of US actions in Afghanistan. On the contrary, we see this as an opportunity. I think Australians, like many in Asia, are very cognizant of the fact that, as the President said last week, there is no vital national interest for the United States in the Middle East. And so following that focus on realpolitik, which we're seeing emerge in aspects of the Biden administration's foreign policy, it simply doesn't follow to be concerned that where we do perceive the United States having vital interests, and we do see those in Japan, South Korea, Australia, the treaty allies in Southeast Asia, and Taiwan, we do expect and are not concerned that the United States will remain committed to those alliance partners. It's a chalk and cheese discussion to suggest otherwise. And frankly, from an Australian perspective, it doesn't add up that even Europeans would be concerned about US treaty commitments in that way. Perhaps this is because of the much more realistic sense of the nature of US alliances that Asian countries tend to have about their partnerships and their alliances with the United States. The final point I want to make is, again, to riff off Kuni's points, we hope that, as the President stated last week, this will provide for an opportunity to rebalance US equities to the Indo-Pacific, but we remain concerned at the direction of the Biden administration's foreign policy in Asia so far. The principal reason for that concern is that for all of the talk of the United States prioritizing strategic competition with China, the way that this has played out in the first 6 months of the administration has been predominantly focused on long-term global issues rather than immediate regional priorities. And we see that the competition for influence between the United States and China in Asia is lagging for a couple of reasons. First, the United States doesn't have an economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And given the nature of US politics and public support for trade agreements at this point in time, it doesn't appear like it will have one in the near term, certainly not before the midterms and perhaps not after. Second, the United States doesn't and hasn't yet made substantial changes to its Asian military posture over the last decade, to say nothing of the last few months. And indeed, we look to the nature of US posture in Asia as being the backstop of its commitments in many ways. We haven't seen that investment. And finally, the focus on issues of global democracy, of technology standards, of investment in the governance arrangements of the future, while very important, are not those that resonate the most or have the most impact on influence in Asia from an Australian or from a regional perspective. So indeed, we would like to see that in the wake, and once the dust settles in Afghanistan, and the administration can begin to focus on other things, we would like to see these regional investments prioritized.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, and a very interesting critique of recent policies that I'm sure we'll come back to. You know, I did have one question though. You very strongly suggested that now it's possible to shift toward East Asia or toward the Indo-Pacific. But there are two issues following also on some of the challenges that Kuni mentioned about, power vacuums and also certain other issues that could well push the United States, not only the US, but Australia, as you mentioned. Australia has been relocating to the Indo-Pacific. The two that I wonder about are terrorism and energy. Of course, Australia has, bountiful supplies of many sorts of energy, but conspicuously not the oil that comes in such volumes and in a concentrated way out of the Gulf. Is it really possible for Australia and the United States to make this shift if we have terrorism and if we have these underlying energy dependencies?
They're really important considerations, and you're right to point them out. In the case of terrorism, that remains a concern for Australia, although I would say that principally Australia, like many regional countries in Asia, that is, concern about terrorism is one about terrorism in the region. So of course, it's really incumbent now on the US, Australia, Southeast Asian countries, Japan, South Korea to work together and to ensure that there isn't, from the ruins of Afghanistan, a return to some of the terrorism in the mid 2010s, the early 2000s that we saw here in the Indo-Pacific, here in Southeast Asia in particular, and of course targeted directly against Australians in Indonesia. But I think from an Australian perspective, that threat is manageable in region and doesn't warrant the kinds of long-term deployments in the Middle East. Australia does support and did prior to the withdrawal an enduring counter-terrorism mission in the Middle East, and was willing to commit to that. And so to the extent that that might return, I think you would see Australian support. In the case of energy, I mean, it's a critical point. From an Australian perspective, one of the biggest problems we face is a failure by Australia to invest in domestic petroleum reserves, including airplane fuel here in Australia. And to do those, we are the country that doesn't live up to the International Energy Agency requirements for petroleum, strategic petroleum reserves. That could give us a degree of latitude more than we have right now. Australia does rely on Middle Eastern oil more than the United States, frankly. The United States is moving more quickly towards energy independence than Australia. And although Australia has bountiful supplies of, both old and new forms of energy, oil is a problem. But again, having said that, from an Australian perspective, the war in Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent Syria, became distractions of securing that, not enabling factors. And so I think there, provided the sea lanes are secure between the Gulf and Australia, and provided we don't see the kind of resurgent regional power rise in the form of Iran or another challenge that dominance that the West has over Persian Gulf choke points, then we wouldn't consider that a strategic risk.
I see. That's fascinating. Then that suggests that really there are preconditions to a shift toward the Indo-Pacific, defensive preconditions such as counter-terror policy, and also stockpiling and energy policies that diffuse the risk that you have there. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. As our next participant, we have Professor Joseph Liow, who has a distinguished career both in Singapore, also in the United States. He was with the Brookings Institution as their Lee Kuan Yew chair at Brookings. And we, of course, Southeast Asia is a key piece of this equation. There have been terror-related issues in the past. There may be those issues in future. Its development with 500 million people or so, and growing economy is certainly crucial from a global perspective. But many countries there in a complex situation. How do you read that right now, Joseph?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ken, for the introduction and for sort of laying the pieces out as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, and challenging me to sort of make some sense out of it. I think let me get at these issues by making 3 quick points and introducing one caveat to the discussion. Yeah, and I think using Afghanistan as the point of departure, I think the salience of the withdrawal from Afghanistan for Southeast Asia's regional dynamics perhaps manifests in 3 ways. The first, as Ashley and yourself had alluded to already, is terrorism, of course, and mindful also that we are commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11. For Southeast Asia, there is obviously something of historical analogy at work here with the situation in Afghanistan. We will recall that Southeast Asians numbered among the international jihadis who flocked to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, and significantly, the bulk of the Southeast Asian jihadis who spent time there were there during the period of the Taliban rule, which was from the mid-90s onwards. So it was during that time that people who had links with the Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines, JI in Indonesia, KMM, the Kumpulan Militant Malaysia from Malaysia, linked up with various Al-Qaeda elements during this time, and they were, of course, also given sanctuary by the Taliban government. Today, we see the terrorist dimension to Afghanistan take on a slightly different dimension or twist, which is ISIS, right? And in particular, ISIS Khorasan, which is active in Afghanistan. The concern now is that ISIS in Afghanistan might catalyze pro-ISIS groups in Southeast Asia, of which there are still quite a number. But we also bear in mind that there is, as we have heard, differences, if not tensions, between ISIS and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this will be reflected, in fact, already reflected in Southeast Asia in the tension that exists, for example, between the Jamaat Islamiyah groups and those that came after it on one hand, and the pro-ISIS groups on the other hand. So this is something to keep an eye on how this plays out. The second issue is this question of uncertainty surrounding American commitment, right? I think it's quite clear that adversaries of the US have really tried to leverage on Afghanistan to cast a very harsh light on the reliability of American commitment. Yeah. In my view, I think this argument isn't getting as much mileage as these adversaries of the US would have liked in Southeast Asia. I think there are two broad reasons why that is so. First, we're dealing with a situation where Afghanistan was really seen as a distraction that took away attention and resources, right? That was required to pursue earlier US strategies to deepen engagement with Asia. I think, again, Ashley alluded to this, and I totally agree. So in a sense, it's if we don't want to say pivot, it's certainly some kind of a swing or rebalance back to Asia. And second, these are fundamentally different strategic contexts for the US, Southeast Asia and Afghanistan, Central Asia. And so the objectives also have been very different. Yeah? So it's comparing apples and oranges here to some extent. Afghanistan, as we know, was essentially about the war on terror, extending the war on terror, dealing with a specific and at that time an immediate threat. The issue of Southeast Asia's strategic value to the US, however, as you know very well, Ken, has been a subject of immense debate for a long time and still not resolved. Right. Yeah. But in today's strategic context, compared to Afghanistan, I think a number of things, right? The sea lanes of communication, the economic potential of the region gives strategic, some degree at least, of strategic leverage to the US. And we should bear that in mind. But having said that, we also should realize that this should not be taken for granted, in the sense that the US, the tendency for the US to value Southeast Asia, for example, because of the China factor and its rivalry and competition with China, this for Southeast Asia is grounds for lament, right? Although I won't get into the details here, we can discuss that later. But the perennial issue being Southeast Asia trying to impress upon the US its inherent strategic value as a region, rather than have everything viewed through the lenses or the optics of China and rivalry with China. And a third point, very quickly, is the flurry of activity, primarily the visit of Vice President Harris, but also Tony Blinken's participation in ARF and Secretary Austin's visit to Southeast Asia. This happened around about the same time as the withdrawal, as we know. In a sense, it's a reminder of the efforts by the Biden administration with regards to prioritizing Asia, and certainly for Southeast Asia, the first 6 months we were sort of feeling some angst as to the lack of attention. So this flurry of activity has to be viewed in that regard. It addressed Southeast Asia's concerns to some extent that they were being neglected, right? So, for example, Vice President Harris could easily have postponed or cancelled the trip, given the hasty evacuation from Kabul, but she didn't do that. Having said that, as with all trips, it's never sort of as welcomed as it was never 100% perfect. Didn't hit many right pitches, but not all of them. So for example, there's been lament that ASEAN didn't get as much attention. In her speech in Singapore, ASEAN was mentioned, I think, only once. There was no commitment on behalf of the president for his attendance at the EAS later this year. No announcement of an ASEAN ambassador. That would have been a good platform. And then there's the perennial debate over who was visited and who wasn't visited in Southeast Asia, right? The obvious one being Indonesia, that Indonesia was not one of the countries that was on the schedule. So to some extent, there's some reading of tea leaves here, but we should be mindful of the overall picture that generally this flurry of activities has been welcomed by the region, but the devil is in the detail, right? So now we are waiting to see what the follow-up is. Now, let me end with a caveat. Now, the caveat is this, that I think the real issue here that Afghanistan casts is that Afghanistan casts a light on this perennial challenge of US domestic politics and the appetite for involvement in faraway places. Yeah, I think the Afghanistan withdrawal and everything surrounding it reminds us again that US politics remains polarized, possibly more polarized than we've seen since the late 60s, early 70s. And this will be a considerable obstacle for the Biden administration or any administration for that matter in their desire to stake a more consequential presence in the region. And I think we've seen enough of this dynamic playing out over the years and decades that the region doesn't have illusions about the challenges that the Biden administration faces. I will end there.
Well, that is really fascinating. And to me, it raises one question that I did have, and I can already see in the chat. We've begun to get something on that. Namely, well, to put it simply, the United States is far away from Southeast Asia. Of course, there are many interests, including many global interests, strategic interests, and so on. But some of those don't resonate strongly in domestic politics, exactly as you said. The United States is somewhat polarized. The cost has been great of this Afghan war. And just as after Vietnam, there may be some reluctance to have deep involvement. Conversely, of course, China is close by. China's next door. One of the points there, or question, I could put it in the form of a question. Given what you said about the America's distance and detachment, there have been some encouraging remarks, exactly as you said, Vice President Harris and Secretary of State Blinken and so on. Some of it's been general, some of it's been very global, like digital trade and so on. But China has BRI. They're throwing a lot of money at it. It's right close by. Doesn't that countervail these interests? And going forward, doesn't Afghanistan create a cautionary note for America's allies and friends? How far is the U.S. going to go in sustaining its commitments?
That's a good question, Ken. And actually, truth be told, this question of the sustainability of American commitment and reliability of American commitment has been one, as you well know, that vexed Southeast Asia long before Afghanistan and American involvement in Afghanistan, right? I mean, it essentially came out of Vietnam, right? After the US withdrawal from Vietnam, there was a good decade and a half where you know, I think for one of a better sort of way of describing it, the US essentially just wanted to forget the experience of Vietnam. And as a result of that, it affected policy towards Southeast Asia. But it is also true, I think, that Southeast Asia has always been what a good American friend used to tell me, a very hard sell in the US, especially on Capitol Hill. Yeah, it's different when you talk to people in state, in defense, in national security, but really in terms of the politics that links it back to domestic constituencies, Southeast Asia has always been a very hard sell. And therefore, it is incumbent, I think, at least in part, incumbent on the Southeast Asian states to really hammer home, drive home, make the case, you know, for for American engagement in the region, and even to the extent of explaining to the United States why it is in their interest, in your interest, to be more deeply engaged in Southeast Asia. It's not easy because, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, Ken, Southeast Asia is 10 states, and you know, it's one thing to engage the US, the great power of the US, collectively as ASEAN 10 states, and it's another thing to be engaging bilaterally. So I think a number of Southeast Asian states, you know, some place more emphasis on bilateral engagements than more collective effort at engagement. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration as well. But just very quickly on the BRI, yes, indeed, the BRI is a major factor for Southeast Asia. But again, in the spirit of the devil being in the details, as many of the people tuning in know, that when you look at some of the details of the BRI projects, and the BRI really is just a collection of projects, isn't it? If you look at some of the details of these projects, you can see that it's not, let's just say, it's not panning out the way the Chinese had hoped it would or had thought that it would. Yeah, they've had to encounter quite a number of root shocks along the way as well. So I don't think it's a done deal as far as China's BRI charm offensive, if I can put it that way.
Well, you said some very important things there, and one thing that really sticks in my mind as a, you know, here at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, you mentioned that Southeast Asia is a hard sell on Capitol Hill, in a way as it has been since, you know, the 1970s. We're moving to Capitol Hill, to 555 Pennsylvania Avenue, in about 18 months, and I can see that we have some work to do and some discussions to be had in future. Thank you very much.
Sure, I hope to visit in 18 months then.
Well, wonderful. We'll look forward to seeing you, if not before. Thanks very much. We appreciate it. Sure. Now, as our final speaker here today, we have someone who is eminently well qualified to consider these issues of Asia after Afghanistan. Ambassador David Shear, also senior fellow here with the Reischauer Center, served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia Pacific Affairs and more senior positions also. And in the State Department, of course, a long distinguished career, including work in Japan, in China, but also as ambassador to Vietnam. So there have been a lot of issues about US policy raised, Dave, as well as the geopolitical context. I wonder how you see those things.
Thank you very much, Kent, and thanks for having me on the panel today. I'd like to start by talking about China and South Asia a little bit, and then I'll move to East Asia and Southeast Asia. With regard to China and Afghanistan, I think that main Chinese interest in Afghanistan is in stability. Afghanistan, of course, borders China, however short that border may be, and China wants stable and friendly neighbors, Afghanistan included. I think Chinese concerns about the potential export of terrorism are closely linked to that. The Chinese have been assiduous in eliciting from the Taliban pledges that they won't export terrorism, but the extent to which they can prevent that certainly remains to be seen, although the Taliban have been assiduous in providing those assurances. The Chinese have been very careful in ensuring that they maintain contact with the Taliban. A Taliban delegation headed by Taliban leader Abdul Ghani Baradar visited Beijing in June. I'm sure that counterterrorism was high on the agenda for those meetings. The Chinese embassy in Kabul remains open, and the Chinese welcomed the establishment of the Taliban interim government. The Chinese must be looking at the Taliban takeover as a victory for their Pakistani partners and as a loss for India. The Indians are clearly concerned about the effect that the Taliban win will have on Pakistani behavior, particularly in Kashmir, I would imagine. It isn't clear whether China will try to exert influence on Islamabad in promoting restraint among the Pakistanis. India has always been preoccupied with the threat from Pakistan, particularly the terrorist threat. But in the past few years, the Indians have focused a lot more attention on Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and the still modest but important Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean. And we'll want to see that the Indians maintain that attention to East Asia, that they continue looking east, and that the threat from Pakistan doesn't gobble up all of their attention and resources. Mm-hmm. Pakistan's victory in Afghanistan may force much more Indian attention on Kashmir and the Northwest. And if I were in the US government, I would be trying to reassure the Indians with offers of increased cooperation in counterterrorism. I'd also be trying to ensure that Indian participation in the Quad and the Malabar naval exercises continues, and that their attention increases, in fact. On Wednesday, the Pakistanis hosted a meeting to discuss the region with China, Iran, and Afghanistan's Central Asian neighbors. Russia appears to have been absent. The news reports about this meeting have focused on the Chinese offer of $31 million in assistance to Afghanistan, mostly foodstuff and health-related materials such as vaccines. But I would imagine that stability in Afghanistan and the need to manage refugee flows from Afghanistan to its neighbors, as well as the need to manage the terrorist threat, particularly the potential terrorist threat from all of these refugee flows, were high on the agenda for that meeting. So the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan has left a lot of uncertainty, not only in Afghanistan, but in the region, particularly with regard to India-Pakistan relations and China's role in that relationship. And hopefully the Chinese will seek to play a stabilizing role but that remains to be seen. With regard to East Asia and the American role in East Asia, certainly we've all been told that the American departure from Afghanistan will allow the US to place a higher priority on East Asia and particularly Southeast Asia. We understand the strategic value of Southeast Asia on its own, but also the US can't compete with China unless it competes with China for influence in Southeast Asia. So we'll all be looking for the extent to which the administration can pivot, if you'll allow me to use that term, from Afghanistan, paying attention to Afghanistan to placing a higher priority on East Asia. And it's clear that the administration was heavily focused on Afghanistan from the start, not just from the president's announcement of our withdrawal in April. I have no doubt that the senior-most leaders in the US, the NSC, were spending a lot of time on Afghanistan right from the inauguration, if not before. There will be some crucial events coming up at which the US can demonstrate a new focus on the Indo-Pacific. One of those is the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly always provides a great opportunity for us to conduct multilateral engagements with our East Asian allies and partners and friends, as well as bilateral events. So we'll be watching for how the President and Secretary Blinken engage with our East Asian friends and partners, particularly ASEAN at the UNGA. Also coming up at the end of October and early November are the G20 and the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. G20 in Rome, COP26 in Glasgow. And there is talk of a possible presidential meeting with President Xi on the margins of the G20. Nothing solid on that yet, but if you haven't seen the news yet today, you missed news about the president's conversation overnight with President Xi Jinping. They spent 90 minutes on the phone. The American readout doesn't explicitly mention Afghanistan, but I suspect Afghanistan was on the agenda. The EAS summit also is coming up in late October, as is the APEC summit. The president will need to show strong participation in both these, both in terms of his presence, his attention, but also in terms of substance. If I were the administration, I'd be working on a quad meeting as well. So we have a full East Asian agenda, which will to some extent signal the extent to which the US can actually shift its attention to East Asia. We have an upcoming release of a conclusion of a China policy study within the administration, as well as the upcoming release of a posture review regarding our global military posture. It will be important for the administration to show signs in that we are shifting adequate military resources to the region as well. Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Kent.
Well, thanks very much, Dave. You've really outlined a number of opportunities for the U.S. Going forward, very concretely. And what I take from this is that we have an uncertain, turbulent situation in which the United States can't afford to, simply to relax and look at the situation passively. There's a whole series of specific action items where we need to act. I should just ask you, you've outlined a number of meetings here. Now we're in very much a virtual world where it's easier to organize these kind of broad activities, including multilateral. Are any of these that you have talked about, which of these are in person that would require travel that would constrain you as the president? And which of these are things where he can kind of flip the dial from one to another and be engaged in a large number of them almost simultaneously?
I think the current plan for the East Asia Summit is that it be virtual. I don't know if the APEC organizers I don't know if the APEC organizers have decided whether or not the APEC Summit, I think the first week of November, will be virtual yet. It looks to me like the COP26 and Rome currently are planning on having live meetings, but that could change.
I see, sure. Well, ironically, it could well be that diplomacy would be easier, this kind of complex stuff, if we went back to a tougher pandemic situation, it sounds like, or where we went back to virtual.
That could very well be. And in that regard, I like to echo what Joe said about how hard it is to get Washington to focus on Southeast Asia. It's not only hard to get Washington to focus on Southeast Asia, it's hard to get Washington to travel to Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And it's always a challenge convincing presidents that they need to go to Southeast Asia and tend the diplomatic garden, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but it's critically important.
But they can do it virtually. But does that help them get their feet wet to do this virtually?
Well, I think doing it virtually is a distant second best. There's nothing like personal contact.
Sure.
Not only in domestic politics, but in foreign policy as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. That's all quite fascinating. Now, we have, of course, an extraordinary group of specialists on this part of the world. I really, of course, we have you in Washington. We have Professor Miyake in Tokyo. We have Ashley Townshend in Sydney, and then Joseph Liow in Singapore. And we've all been sort of talking bilaterally here. It's kind of a hub and spokes situation, but there's a lot to be said in this rich discussion, I think, among all of us. And we also have, I can see, we're beginning to get some questions in the chat. I wonder if we might, everyone might come on to the screen, and then we could address some of the issues that are considered generally. I don't know. First off, does anyone have responses to some of the interesting and important things that we've heard? Of course, one of the right at the core across many people's presentation is just how possible and likely it is that the United States is going to be able, in the wake of Afghanistan, to shift toward a coherent Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't know. Would anyone like to address that question first off? Yes, Dave.
Well, the administration certainly has been very vocal in stating its desire to shift attention from Afghanistan to the Asia Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific. But successive administrations have said that as well. And actually shifting our attention doesn't just mean saying that we're going to do it. It means showing up at East Asian meetings. It means doing the diplomacy on the ground necessary to strengthen our influence throughout the region. It means putting the military forces in the region necessary to maintain conventional deterrence. It means devising, as Ash said, it means devising an economic policy to the region. The US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you've all heard it before, was a strategic blunder on the part of the United States. The TPP was not just meant to benefit its members economically. It was strategic. It was meant to ensure that its members, particularly in Southeast Asia, didn't have to accommodate themselves to all of China's economic interests. The Vietnamese got that. Everybody got that. And we need to devise an alternative to that. I'm not certain that a digital services agreement, such as the one the administration may be contemplating, will be enough.
I wonder, from our friends outside the United States, that's a harsh indictment of some aspects of American policy. I don't know. How do you all react?
I mean, just to add to Dave's points there, I mean, I'd foot stomp them all. He's absolutely right. I'd go further into some specifics. We've heard a very big game from the administration that has been welcomed in the aftermath of the Trump years, but we haven't seen the pork. Case in point was the way that the administration and the Pentagon under this administration handled the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Now, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, as some of the audience will know, was a proposal by US Indo-Pacific Command to do what both Europe and the Middle East has had done for those regions: inject significant, in the vicinity of $5 billion a year, additional Pentagon resources to posture, logistics, enablers, munitions, exercises with allies and partners for this part of the world, the part of the world that the Pentagon itself deemed to be the priority theater. But it hasn't happened. And we've seen this administration and the Pentagon not gravitate towards supporting that, not seem particularly interested in the nature of those posture requirements that the commander of Indo-Pacific Command has laid out fairly methodically. And that, I have to say, from a regional perspective, and I think I'm speaking more broadly than an Australian perspective here, that causes concerns about the way US is thinking about investing in short-term conventional deterrence here in Asia. Now, it's not all bad news on the military front. Next week, you'll see the Australia-US ministerial dialogue take place in Washington, D.C., the first of the Biden years. And we anticipate that we will see coming out of that an upgrade to the US-Australia posture arrangements that should in time see something, some form of upgrade to the existing air cooperation that sees US bombers and fighters access Australian airfields to our north, and hopefully broaden that out to include a maritime component in Western Australia abutting the Indian Ocean. We also anticipate that there'll be some progress on an Australian request for the US to help Australia develop its own sovereign munitions manufacturing capability here on this country. These requests ought to be easy, low-hanging fruit, but they're not. And they're not because there is, as everyone has said on this call this morning, residual disinterest or domestic political obstacles to doing what has happened in other parts of the world in Asia. That causes concern. The final point I'd make, just to build again on Dave's points about the TPP, we do understand that the TPP is not possible right now, but it is the solution to the problem articulated by Chinese economic coercion, the size of the Chinese market, China's Belt and Road Initiative. But even in the absence of the TPP, while we're waiting for politics to return to something that might see that become possible in the future, what the region needs is a clear and believable articulation that the United States still views Asian markets and Asian economies as integral to their own prosperity. That's not apparent right now. And until that's apparent, there will remain concerns about the extent to which the United States can be committed to an Indo-Pacific strategy.
Mm-hmm. That's very articulate. Kuni, I can see that you have something. Oh, you're still muted. Kuni, you're muted.
When the United States left TPP, I thought that it was going to be mothballed. But actually, Japan took the initiative, and to my surprise, we kept the TPP 11. So we are waiting for you, Dave. Come back.
Very well put. I think we'd all agree with that. Joseph.
Yeah, can I just come in here?
Sure.
Just maybe for the sake of discussion, let me flag a few sort of more positive, or put a more positive spin on what has been going on with regards to US efforts to re-engage the region and certainly Southeast Asia. The first is China's response to this flurry of activities. I think we will be seeing some interesting developments that suggest that China realizes that they need to react to this sudden interest in US Southeast Asia engagement. Yeah, and we will see some movement on that front quite soon. Yeah, because the Chinese, I think, have taken an interest in the impact of this uptick of US recent US efforts to re-engage the region, and they will have to respond to that. Second, the Biden administration has made it very clear that it is going to place much more emphasis on multilateralism now, or multilateral approaches to its engagement. Now, that is a bit of a double-edged sword in the sense that on the one hand, it's great because it suggests that the US is prepared to listen, to dialogue with its friends and partners, perhaps in a more concrete way compared to the previous administration. But on the other hand, of course, it also means that the US will probably expect friends and partners to up their game, right? And to sort of increase their own skin in the game. And certainly from the perspective of Southeast Asia, that's an interesting conundrum, right? To what extent Southeast Asia, ASEAN for that matter, is prepared to sort of bring more onto the table. And the third, I totally agree with everyone about the missed opportunity of the TPP, but we shouldn't forget that the United States and Japan, for that matter, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, these two countries continue to be by far the largest investors in Southeast Asia. You know, whatever the narrative of China's economic goodies may be. Yeah? And if anything, I think in terms of public diplomacy on the part of Japan and on the part of the United States, not enough effort has been put in to showcase that dimension of American and Japanese involvement. Primarily private sector, no doubt, rather than government, but still substantial.
Really, I think made an important point. It builds on what Kuni was saying earlier, a very important observation, I think, that when the United States pulled back from TPP, Japan with TPP 11 did at least cushion some of the effects on the region. So going forward, the ways in which Japan and the United States can cooperate, well, and of course the Quad and the key role for Australia and India hasn't been mentioned, but those broader configurations, the way they can cushion this transition, especially in the economic side, is something important. Yes, Dave, yes, we look forward to one more comment from you. And I see we have like 13 comments, questions in the Q&A. So Dave, after yours, maybe we can take other things in the context of answering some of the people that are clamoring out there.
I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the diplomatic dimension, particularly in Southeast Asia. We've talked about military posture. We've talked about the need for economic policy. We need a much more robust, much more vigorous diplomatic approach to the region. And that has to start with getting our ambassadors out there. I checked yesterday, and as of yesterday, we did not yet have ambassadors in Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, Hanoi, Manila, Singapore, Bangkok, or Canberra. We've named ambassadors for some of those, but they appear to be getting held up by the Senate. So we need to get our ambassadors out there. Ambassadors are not just clerks at the end of the email chain. They're integral to finding diplomatic opportunities for us on the ground and coordinating with our friends, partners, and allied embassies on the ground. That's how we do effective diplomacy regionally. And we need to put more emphasis on that. The Quad is an important tool at the more senior levels, but it can be used at embassy levels as well. The Quad needs to be viewed as a diplomatic tool, not just as a nascent military alliance. It will be much more effective in the present as a diplomatic tool than it will be as a nascent alliance. We need to use it as a diplomatic tool. I think the administration got a good start with the Quad Summit after they came in, I believe it was in March, but they need to elaborate on that considerably. And I hope we'll see another Quad Summit before the end of the year.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a rather unique, I haven't really heard that notion before, the operationalizing the Quad at the embassy level, and also thinking about ambassadors and embassies as a more dynamic element in diplomacy. We actually, of course, thanks to you and several other ambassadors who've been with us at the Reischauer Center, this is one of our major research concerns right now, is thinking about embassies and the kind of role that they can play. And what you've said, I think, is really something important. We do have, as I mentioned, a large number of questions. Maybe, unless someone has something that they think is urgent, we have about another 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So let me mention some of the questions, and those who would like to take a stab at them, if they could just indicate that. The first one, which I thought was rather interesting, but it hadn't come up at all, related to the Taiwan situation. And the question was, how likely is it, and well, a lot of the argument I know people have heard, but will there be some sort of a relationship between these developments in Afghanistan, the decision of the United States to pull back and so on, and broader American deterrence, and the perception that the United States stands by its commitments? And of course, there's other factors on the ground, and our main focus here is not Taiwan, but after the Beijing Olympics in particular, given this Afghan situation, does it intensify the danger of an escalation of the Taiwan situation? Would anyone like to address that?
Well,
Yes.
they are our neighbor, so I should talk a little bit. In a nutshell, if I were the leader of China, I would think 3 times before I do it. Because, of course, there are voices and there are some arguments about the possible unification attempt of armed attack against Taiwan, etc. But of course, there's always theoretically a possibility. But if they fail, once they fail, it's not just a failure. It could be the end of the regime. It could be the end of the administration. So I think we still can deter whatever unification attempt by force by China. And I always say this when asked this question. First of all, there's a small island called Yonagunijima. It's only 110 kilometers away from Taiwan. So if they really want to surround and invade Taiwan, they have to invade our territory. So there'll be no independent Taiwan contingency. It will be most likely Japan contingency. So, and in addition to that, if they really want to liberate Taiwan, they have to attack US forces in Japan. And do you want to do that? I think that's the way we should deter their ambition against Taiwan.
Very interesting. Japan is a key factor in the Taiwan situation. And of course, Secretary or Minister of Defense Kishi has also, and some Japanese politicians have also stressed the importance there. Yes, Ash Townshend.
Thanks. I just wanted to add on the Taiwan point, two observations. First is, I think it should be noted that this year since, well, really since this time last year, you've seen Taiwan mentioned as an issue of concern in the bilateral ministerial engagements between all of the United States principal Asian allies for the first time in a very long time. You've also seen it mentioned in discussions between US allies themselves, not including the United States, including Australia-Japan consultations, Japan-Korea, and Australia-France. That's an extremely significant development. It shows greater regional and global attention on the plight of Taiwan, on the threats to its sovereignty, its security, and certainly a willingness to consult and think about that as a diplomatic strategic problem. Secondly, what that begins to, I think, show, and there's a lot more with regards to US allies together and in trilateral and quadrilateral arrangements that I think supports this. What that begins to show is that regional countries are not entirely waiting for US rebalance, and of course we can't balance China without the United States, but there is much more security networking, much more what we call collective defense thinking taking place, again, between Japan, Australia, key Southeast Asian countries, India, and so forth. Just yesterday, Australia and Indonesia raised a new agreement for Indonesian forces being able to train more expansively in Australia and attend the best Australian defence colleges. That's just a micro example of what's happening across the board, and not just with Australia, but with Japan, with India, with the other treaty allies in the region. So this movement, we've talked about security networking for a decade, is really accelerating on the specific issue of Taiwan and on the broader issue of regional deterrence.
Okay, thank you. If there's a lot of other interesting questions, if no one has further comments on that. Another important issue that was raised is the US relationship with India. How this Afghan situation, the US withdrawal from there is going to affect that. And of course, India has been deeply involved with Afghanistan as a matter of balancing the Pakistan and so on. So how will U.S.-India relations evolve in the wake of this, of the Afghan withdrawal? Anyone to that question?
I can take that. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the U.S. has a very strong interest in engaging India across the board, of course, but particularly on the subject of the Indo-Pacific. American policymakers can get very enthusiastic about the potential for cooperation with India. And I think sometimes they can get over-enthusiastic. We need to remember that India's primary strategic foci are Pakistan and Chinese presence along their land borders. And to the extent that we can engage the Indians in conversations on those subjects, I think it will open up opportunities for us to further engage them on the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, South China Sea, Indian Ocean. So my concern is that the situation in Afghanistan emboldens the Pakistanis and increases the prospects for Pakistani and Taliban supported terrorism in India, particularly in Kashmir. And that's something we should be engaging the Indians on. That's a subject we should be engaging the Indians on.
Now, thank you, Dave. There's several questions that take the discussion about China and the US in a counterintuitive direction. And someone mentioned earlier that there have been, I think it was you, some extended talks just in the last couple of days between President Biden and President Xi. And so there's one question here about cooperative development in Afghanistan. Can one consider the possibility, the Khyber Pass Economic Corridor was mentioned, US engaging in economic development with China and regional countries. One other possibility I can see, if we had peace in Afghanistan, the Central Asian energy exports, for example, the so-called TAPI pipeline to India to help to supply India's energy needs might be more likely. What prospect do we have for cooperative development flowing out of the coming of peace or semi-peace or whatever you want to call it in Afghanistan? Anybody?
Well, the short answer is very unlikely. Having studied Arabic and I based in the Middle East for too long, I always think about the worst case scenario. And in most cases, I have been right. So I don't think that anybody can stabilize, control, and stabilize the entire Afghanistan because it's a mountainous area, so many tribes and ethnic groups with different backgrounds, and no monarchy, and no religious sort of moderate religious school anymore. I continue to be very pessimistic about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting because that leads to another question that I just saw. Namely, someone was asking, we were talking about Taiwan and escalation of tensions and so on there. And it was really a converse scenario that because of instabilities in Afghanistan and some of what you're talking about there, that actually there would be a redirection of Chinese resources to the West. And that this might lead to, what kind of an effect on Chinese defense policy is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan likely to have? This maybe, Kuni, that might be in your area, but anyone who'd like to take that.
Well, the short answer is I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but the Chinese civilization doesn't get along with Islam. The Chinese don't understand Islam and they don't know how to deal with Islam. So even if they make friends with the Taliban, as I might have told you before, Taliban have too many enemies inside and outside. And if China becomes a friend of Taliban, then they make dozens of enemies at the same time. I don't think that China can afford going west to achieve their strategic goals. And on the contrary, they have to face a threat, different kinds of threat against China in the coming years if they decided to stay in Afghanistan and help the Taliban.
So then it sounds like that must mean that this withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan really may not benefit Beijing substantially at all because it creates some new dangers. China won't be, they'll be hesitant to be involved, but they'll be wary about them, and they're not about to plunge in.
Well, that could be my wishful thinking.
Can I just come in here for a couple minutes?
Please. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think whether it is China seizing the opportunity to enhance its presence in Afghanistan, or even the earlier question about some sort of cooperative effort, I think it really isn't. I mean, the challenge is not obviously not the economics of it, although that will be challenging. But really, it's the security dimension, because there's an assumption here that the Taliban will be able to sort of in a monolithic way handle the inherent tribalism and the tensions therein in Afghan society, which is certainly not a given, I don't think. And it's going to be very much part of the instability that is going to bedevil Afghanistan, including the Taliban government. And that instability is going to give rise to all sorts of conflict and security challenges that will confront any effort at economic kind of development and building of economic corridors. So if China wants to go in there, it has to not just go in with its state-owned enterprise construction companies and state-owned bank investments. Security forces have to go in there as well. Yeah, and there is every risk that it's going to be dragged into this very unstable kind of situation. So I think the Chinese will have to think twice, 3, 4 times. Anyone would have to do that. And if it is any kind of economic development that is supposed to link Afghanistan to India, then you cannot help but think that Pakistan is going to feature in that equation as well. So it's not a very encouraging scenario we're looking at.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joseph, on that. Now we had one question about Japan and, well, in Australia, maybe starting with Professor Townshend, about development efforts in Afghanistan after the departure of the US. What about, and more maybe by extension, any countries outside the US? Of course, Afghanistan's going to face pressing economic problems. What about international assistance or engagement by countries beyond the United States? Ash, I don't know, how do you see that?
Yeah, I'll be brief given time, but look, Australia is, like much of the West, committed to rhetorically continuing to support Afghan people and continuing to maintain development assistance and so forth. But of course, how that's done and the way the trade-offs in terms of recognizing the Taliban and having a reasonable sense of what it will stand for is where the reality checks in. And so how that will be possible going forward, I don't think anyone really has the answer. I'll note to show the extent of this difficult choice that needs to be made, the Australian Cricket Federation decided yesterday that it would cancel its test match with the Afghan cricket team. Now that might seem like melding sport and geopolitics a little bit too far for this discussion, but one of the reasons that they did that was principally because it would have recognized a Taliban-backed team, and at the same time, it would have recognized the Taliban now-backed cricket federation that at the same time is hunting down Afghanistan's female cricket team, now prohibited to play sport as women in that country. So these are very hard issues. They're going to bleed into a range of areas that we haven't foreseen yet. And I don't think that we have easy answers there.
Well, thank you very much. We're coming close to our appointed hour. There's one last question. I don't know if there's a quick answer to that several people asked about the U.S. role. Several people talked about U.S. capacity. Dave, you in particular, you stressed that a U.S., I guess, some kind of boots on the ground somewhere was one element that might be critical going forward to show commitment and for leverage, not only for the U.S., but other partners in the region. How viable that is politically, both in the United States and elsewhere in the region. That question was there. I don't know. Do you have any quick words on that issue?
Well, I think it's a real challenge. We need to have a sustainable, capable, and well spread out deterrent force through East Asia, and finding places to put more forces will be very challenging. We are not the kind of allies with the Philippines that we used to be, for example. Most Southeast Asians want to hedge, and they don't want to allow permanent places for U.S. They don't want to grant permanent spaces for U.S. forces in fear of a Chinese reaction. So we're going to have to find innovative ways of operating and maintaining our presence. Part of that is working with the Australians. Part of that is maybe strengthening Guam and putting facilities on Palau. But we're going to need better ways of operating, better ways of sustaining our presence.
Thanks very much. We are right at the end of our appointed time. We've had a fascinating discussion. I look forward in the future, and not just when we get to Capitol Hill, but hopefully before that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to these distinguished members of our panel, and thank you to our audience as well. It's a real pleasure to see everyone, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thanks very much.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.